Today, we're going to talk about populations. So far, we've been focusing most of our energy thinking about insects and arthropods more generally as organisms, how they relate to the environment. Now we're going to think about them as a collection of individuals, a population. And what governs the size of those populations? Remember, one of the basic ideas of ecology is to understand the abundance and distribution of organisms. So why are they common in some places at certain times and not so common at other times? This is one of the fundamental questions in population ecology. Here's an example of the dynamics of populations of insects. Take, for example, the case-bearing moth here in black. The populations of these organisms in this particular study seem pretty stable over time through the 1970s and 1980s, and suddenly there was a decline. Actually not so sudden, and maybe it started around here. There was a decline in their abundance from maybe 1.8 log units, so this is a base 10, to almost 2 orders of magnitude, less than that. So what is it that caused the decline in that population? In this particular example, there were 2 parasitic insects that were released in the 1980s as part of a biological control program. And we're going to talk a lot more about biological control in this particular unit. And as their parasitism of the case-bearing moths increased here, not as much for this species here, there seemed to be a concomitant decline in this herbivorous insect. So one of the patterns that we sometimes try to explain are the declines of herbivorous insects, for example, determined by their predators and their parasitoids, like in this case here. Here's a classic study of this particular weevil here, bruchid, that feeds in the seeds of legumes. Here it's a very important stored grains pest. This was actually a laboratory study that they were following, where the population size was quite high for a period of time, fluctuating around some kind of average here, high average that was economically damaging. And upon the release of a parasitoid into these chambers, the parasitoid, increased in abundance, which was associated with a very rapid decline and a different equilibrium of the pest after the introduction of this parasitoid. The applied nature of these particular questions, the suppression of an insect that was causing harm to something that we care about, trees here or stored grains, by the release of a predator, is one of the key things that entomologists have worked on in the field of biological control, and it relies on an understanding of the ecology of populations. In fact, one of the applications of basic ecological principles has been in the study of biological control. And in biological control, the idea is that we're trying to reduce the abundance and damage that is done by non-desirable species through the manipulation of a desirable species, either by intentionally introducing them, increasing their populations, or changing the environment in a way that makes them more effective. This is a summary here of studies that actually looked at that relationship between the introduction of a predator and the consequences for prey. And what you see here is the ratio of the population with the natural enemy compared to that without the natural enemy. And for many biological control introductions that become successful, often the populations with the natural enemy, the predators or the parasites, are about half or more smaller than they are without those. So this is the ratio of population with or without a predator. And in the field, some of these studies here showed that populations with the presence of predators or parasitoids were as much as 99% lower, for example, here, than in the absence of those predators. One of the key things that entomologists working on the population ecology in this applied context posited was that there is an equilibrium that populations are normally at, and manipulation or changes in the relationships with a consumer or a predator. This is often referred to as the equilibrium paradigm. So just like that Bruchid example, the populations kind of fluctuate around some kind of average. When there is the introduction of a consumer, like a predator or parasite, the negative effects of these consumers on the herbivore population cause a decline to some new equilibrium. And if that equilibrium is below a threshold that is considered damaging, then this is a success. This is what we want to see. Part of what we're going to talk about today is the nature of how populations are regulated in the first place, what sets these abundances, and how natural enemies and how predation may be influencing those. One thing that is often obvious when you look at the relationship between a consumer, that is an organism that feeds on a resource, and its resource, is that the consumers can often have a big impact on the abundance of their resources, whether the consumer is a predator feeding on an herbivore on that plant, or whether the consumer is an herbivore feeding on its host plant. Here's an example of this particular weevil here, this little apion that feeds and that lays its eggs, and the larvae feed in the seeds of this particular plant that is often can become a weed in some places. And studies have actually shown that as much as 90% of the seeds of this particular plant could be fed upon by the weevil, limiting the ability of these plants to recruit into the next generation. Interestingly, despite this really high level of herbivory on their host plants, this weed seems to be expanding and remaining at very high levels. So here's a question for you to ponder, and that is, does the intensity of predation necessarily set the size of a population? Why wouldn't that be? Why would that not be the case? Here's another example looking at bark beetles. Bark beetles are eruptive insects. These brown and red areas here are dead trees, basically, that have been fed upon by these bark beetles. And one pattern that was noted by this group of researchers here is that when you look at the population abundance of this southern pine beetle, SPB, over time, population abundance was low over the years here, increased significantly, and then decreased as this outbreak kind of tapered off like that. So again, part of population ecology is trying to understand what causes these fluctuations like this. And bark beetles are actually one of the better understood or better studied, really, systems that we have. And one thing that this group of researchers found doing an experiment looking at one of the predators of the bark beetles, here you can see this clarid beetle feeding on an adult of the southern pine beetle, is that when you compared trees that were either protected or exposed to the predatory beetle, you found that survivorship was significantly lower when the predatory beetles had access to those trees. So so survivorship was less than 20% of when the clarids had access, compared to 30% when there wasn't. And they speculated here, based on this observational study, that this high degree of mortality could be associated with these declines during these. Similarly, what they found is that the population rate of growth of the bark beetles was highest on trees that were where the predators were excluded compared to where the predators were allowed to have access to them. Again, leading more evidence that perhaps this fluctuation, this up and down of the population, is due to the presence and activity of these predators that are decreasing the survivorship and decreasing the population growth rate of the bark beetles. I'll show you one more example here that just summarizes populations of a whole variety of organisms that show that populations often cycle quite a bit for some population. This is the larch bud moth here, voles. These are not insects, obviously. Voles at some latitudes are highly cyclic like this. On the other hand, at other latitudes, populations are much higher and have much more stable dynamics. The dynamics of populations can be highly variable depending on the species and where the species actually occur. One of the groups that I've spent a lot of time working on are these wonderful little chironomids here. And one of the neat things about them is that they have highly variable populations with low or almost non-existent numbers in some years, like here and here and here, and then these wild eruptive abundances that increase by 2 to 3 to 4 orders of magnitude, and then the population crashes right away. Why is that? Why is it that some species have very stable dynamics and others, on the other hand, have highly fluctuating dynamics? And this is actually what it looks like. That's me in a cloud of these midges during one of these years of these highly eruptive dynamics. And here's, on the other hand, an example of the dynamics of the red scale, one of the pests that we talked about at the very beginning of class, that attacks oranges. Red scale is attacked by a variety of introduced parasitoids, including this little aphelenid here. And one of the classic cases of stable populations that don't fluctuate and that seem to be maintained at a lower equilibrium are in fact these red scales and their natural enemies. And here's an example of what happens when you wipe out the natural enemies with the spray of with DDT sprays. Once you've killed off the parasitoids, populations of the red scales can explode and are highly variable. So these are the kinds of examples that people would look at and say, why is it that you have extreme stability in some cases and extreme fluctuations in other cases? Is it because there are these two different equilibria that are maintained by predators, or is there something else going on? Is this equilibrium paradigm really what we need to be thinking about? So the key questions in population ecology are, again, what factors cause the fluctuations in population density or size? What governs the extent of those population fluctuations, why they get big and small? And why is it that some populations are very high and sometimes they're quite low for different species? So what sets the average abundance of those? And we'll spend the remainder of this particular lesson here try to dissect apart some of the factors that might be responsible for that. And of course, I've already alluded to the fact that consumers may be important in driving this. Predators, parasites, disease, things like that.